To most people in Halcourt, Ontario, our family name meant something. Calloway Logistics had been moving freight across the Trans-Canada Highway for 40 years. My father sat on the board of the local business association, sponsored the hockey arena, and shook hands with the mayor at every ribbon-cutting ceremony within 100 kilometers. We were the kind of family that made the front page of the Halcourt Gazette for good reasons. Charitable donations, business expansions, community awards. From the outside, we looked like the definition of Canadian success. From the inside, I knew we were something else entirely. I was 23 when my father called me into his study and told me I was no longer welcome in his house. It wasn't a heated argument that led to it. There was no dramatic screaming match, no broken dishes, no slammed doors. It was worse than that. He sat behind his mahogany desk with a glass of scotch at his elbow and spoke to me the way a CEO addresses a contractor he's decided not to renew. Calm, measured, final. He said I had embarrassed him by refusing to sign the land transfer documents he needed for the expansion. He said I had sided with my mother's family over blood. He said that in this family, loyalty was not optional, and if I couldn't understand that, then I wasn't really a Calloway. My sister came to find me 20 minutes later, sitting on the front steps of the house with my hands between my knees, staring at the frozen driveway. She was 21. She had heard everything through the study door. She sat down beside me, without saying a word, and put her arm through mine, and we stayed like that in the November cold until my father's study light clicked off. She never went back inside either. We had nowhere to go. Our mother had passed 4 years earlier from ovarian cancer, and her side of the family had been quietly erased from our lives in the years since. My father's doing, methodically, the way he did everything. We had a joint bank account with just under $600 between us, a 2018 Civic with a cracked windshield, and a garbage bag of clothes each. My sister had her laptop and her nursing textbooks. I had my phone and a winter jacket that wasn't quite warm enough for a Canadian November night. We drove to a Tim Hortons on the highway and sat in a booth for 3 hours pretending to drink coffee. It was my sister who brought up the storage unit. Grandpa Hugh mentioned it to me, she said, wrapping both hands around her cup. Last Christmas, he said there was a property up near the Haliburton Highlands, a workshop or a cabin or something. He said if we ever needed it, we should take it. I remembered our grandfather the way you remember warmth when you've been cold for a long time. Hugh Calloway, our father's father, nothing like his son. He'd retired from carpentry in his early 70s and spent his last years in a small house outside of Minden. He died 2 winters ago, quietly, in his sleep. Our father had handled the estate with the same efficiency he applied to everything, quickly, and in a way that left no room for question. Did he leave you anything? I asked. A key? An address? She reached into the front pocket of her hoodie and placed a small envelope on the table between us. It was old, the paper gone soft at the folds. My name and her name were written on the front in our grandfather's handwriting. The postmark was from 18 months ago. He'd mailed it before he died, addressed to my sister's old apartment so our father would never see it. Inside was a key on a plain steel ring and a hand-drawn map with a name written at the top in pen. Quiet Lake Road, Dysart et al. Township. Below it, in his careful, slanted script. For when you need it most. Grandpa Hugh. We looked at each other across the table. Do you want to go tonight? She asked. We left at midnight. The drive from Halcourt up to the Haliburton Highlands takes about 2 hours on a good day. In November on back roads. In a car with tires that hadn't been changed since spring, it took us closer to 3. My sister navigated from her phone while I drove, and we didn't talk much. The highway gave way to regional roads. The regional roads gave way to county roads. And eventually, we were moving through dense boreal forest with no streetlights and no other cars, just our headlights cutting through the dark and the occasional glint of a frozen lake through the trees. The map led us down a gravel road that had been recently plowed but not salted. The trees pressed close on both sides. My sister said nothing, but I could see her gripping the door handle. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous. We hadn't seen a building in 20 minutes. The GPS on her phone had given up entirely. Then the road curved and the headlights found a gate. It was a simple farm gate, the old-fashioned kind, chain link with a padlock through the latch. Beyond it, through a gap in the spruce trees, I could see the outline of a structure, low and wide, with a metal roof. I pulled up and killed the engine. We sat there for a moment. "The key," I said. She held it up between two fingers. The padlock opened on the first try. The property was maybe 3 acres, cleared from the surrounding forest a long time ago, the grass long since gone dormant under a crust of frost. The workshop, because that's what it was, a workshop, not a cabin, built from rough-cut timber with a concrete foundation, sat at the far end of the clearing near the edge of what must have been the lake, invisible now in the dark. Beside it was a smaller structure, a woodshed, stacked neatly with split birch, that couldn't have been more than a season old. My grandfather had stacked that wood. He'd known even then. Inside, the workshop smelled like sawdust and oil and something else, something older, like old paper and cedar. My sister found the light switch, and a row of fluorescent tubes buzzed to life overhead. And we stood there blinking. It was not empty. There was a cast iron wood stove along the far wall with a cord of wood stacked beside it. There was a cot with a folded wool blanket. There was a workbench running the full length of one wall, pegboard above it, hung with tools so neatly ordered they looked like a museum exhibit. And there, on the shelf above the workbench, between a row of mason jars and a small battery-powered radio, was a fireproof lockbox, olive green metal, combination lock, with a folded piece of paper taped to the lid. The paper had my sister's name on it. Her hands were shaking when she peeled the tape back. She read the note twice, then handed it to me without a word. "Heather, if you're reading this, things have gone the way I worried they might. The combination is your mother's birthday, month, then day. Inside you'll find what I wasn't able to say out loud while I was alive. I'm sorry it took me this long to be brave. I love you both more than anything in this world. Grandpa Hugh, our mother's birthday." I looked at my sister. Her jaw was set. She took the lockbox down from the shelf with both hands, sat down on the cot, and turned the dials. Month, day. It opened. There were 2 things inside the lockbox. The first was a sealed envelope from a law firm in Peterborough, Mackenzie and Holt, with a letter explaining that a secondary will had been filed with their office, separate from the estate my father had administered, and that the workshop property and its contents had been placed in trust for my sister and me, to be accessed upon our grandfather's death or at our father's direction, whichever came first. There was a contact number and a name, a lawyer called Joanna Fisk. The second was a USB drive taped to an index card. On the card, in my grandfather's handwriting, Hugh Calloway, Personal Records, 2018-2023. My sister looked at the USB drive for a long time. "We need a laptop," she said. She had hers in the car. We lit the wood stove first because the temperatures inside the workshop had dropped below 0 while we stood there with the door open. My sister made tea on a small propane burner she found under the workbench. My grandfather had stocked it: tea bags, powdered milk, a box of arrowroot cookies from the no-name brand, the most Canadian possible emergency supply. We sat side by side on the cot with the laptop balanced on a piece of plywood across our knees, and she plugged in the USB drive. There were 47 files. Most of them were documents. Some were PDFs. Several were audio recordings, the kind you'd make on a cheap voice recorder in a quiet room. The oldest file was dated January 2018. The newest was from 8 weeks before my grandfather died. We didn't sleep that night. We read every document. By the time the sun came up gray through the workshop's single window, we understood why our grandfather had been afraid. And we understood what our father had actually been doing with Calloway Logistics for the past 11 years. The land transfer documents my father had asked me to sign were not what he'd described them as. He had told me they were routine, an internal restructuring, moving a parcel of commercial land in Bracebridge from the company's holdings into a numbered corporation. He'd made it sound like tax strategy, the kind of boring paperwork that runs through family businesses every few years. He'd slid the folder across his desk and handed me a pen. I'd asked to read it first. That was the moment he decided he was done with me. What my grandfather had documented, meticulously, over 5 years, in the careful way of a man who had once built things with his hands and understood the importance of precision, was a systematic fraud. My father had been using Calloway logistics as a pass-through for a private real estate scheme that stretched across 3 counties in central Ontario. He'd been acquiring land at below market value from sellers who didn't know what they were signing, often elderly people or small farmers with no legal representation, using a series of numbered corporations he'd set up under different directors' names. He'd then flipped those properties to commercial developers at full market value. The spread between what he paid and what he collected was somewhere in the range of $4 million over a decade. My grandfather had found out by accident. He'd recognized a property, a farm outside of Kinmount that had belonged to a man he'd done carpentry work for years before, listed in a real estate transaction record that my father had left on his desk during a visit. He'd started paying attention after that. He'd kept records. He'd taken photographs of documents. He'd made notes after phone calls. He'd even recorded 2 conversations, with my father's permission, he'd said, calling to check in on estate matters, during which my father had said things that he would never have said if he'd known the recorder was running. What he hadn't done, while he was alive, was go to anyone with it. In the last audio file, recorded 6 weeks before he died, his voice thin but steady, he explained why. He was afraid of what my father would do to the family. He was afraid of what would happen to my sister and me if he blew everything up before we were in a position to weather it. He said he'd hoped, for a long time, that my father would stop on his own. He said he understood now that he wouldn't, and he said that whatever happened, he wanted us to know that the fault for any of this was never ours to carry. My sister was crying by the end of it, not loudly, just quietly, with her hands folded in her lap. I stared at the wall for a while. Then I called the number on the letter from Mackenzie and Holt. Joanna Fisk answered on the second ring, which surprised me. It was 7:15 in the morning. She told me later she'd been expecting the call for a year. She'd known our grandfather well, had helped him prepare the secondary will, and had been the one to suggest the USB drive as a way of preserving the records in a format that couldn't be easily dismissed. She was practical in a way that I found immediately reassuring. She didn't soften anything, didn't make promises she couldn't keep, didn't tell us it would be simple. "Your father has had 11 years to cover his tracks," she said over speakerphone, while my sister and I sat with our backs against the workshop wall. "But your grandfather was thorough, and some of what's on that drive is very difficult to explain away. The audio in particular." She paused. "You'll want to go through the Ontario Securities Commission for the investor-facing components, and the local RCMP detachment for the fraud side. Those are 2 separate filings. I can help you with both." "How long will this take?" I asked. "These things are never fast," she said, "but you have more than most complainants walk in with. You have documentation going back 5 years, you have direct recordings, and you have someone inside the family structure who was close enough to see what was happening. That matters." My sister asked about the property we were sitting in. "That's yours," Joanna said. "Clear title, properly registered, nothing your father can touch. Your grandfather made sure of that." My sister exhaled slowly. I heard it like a release of something she'd been holding for years. We drove back to Halcourt that afternoon, not to the house, never to that house again, but to a motel on the highway where we paid for 3 nights on my nearly empty debit card and spent the rest of the week working through the files with Joanna over video calls. She helped us organize everything, identify what was most legally significant, and draft the initial complaint. She explained that the OSC complaint would likely result in a formal investigation, that the RCMP complaint would be slower but more consequential, and that if the evidence held up, and she believed it would, the numbered corporations my father had used would be unwound and the proceeds traced. She also mentioned, almost in passing, that there were whistleblower provisions under Ontario's Securities Act that could result in a financial award if the complaint led to a successful enforcement action. My sister wrote that down. The investigation took 14 months. Those 14 months were not easy ones. My sister finished her nursing program and got a job at Ross Memorial Hospital in Lindsay. I found work at a building supply company in Fenelon Falls. Loading dock work, early mornings, the kind of honest physical labor that makes your body tired enough that your brain has to slow down too. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Lindsay together, splitting rent on a budget that left very little room for error. We ate a lot of pasta. We made a lot of trips to the Food Basics on Lindsay Street. We called Joanna every few weeks to check in, and she always told us the same thing. It's moving, it's just slow, be patient. We didn't see our father during that time. He'd heard, through some channel we never identified, that we had filed a complaint. His lawyer sent Joanna a letter. She sent one back. That was the extent of the contact. What kept me going, honestly, was the workshop. We drove up to Haliburton on weekends when we could afford the gas. I started fixing the place up. My grandfather had left tools for a reason, and I found I knew how to use them. The way you sometimes discover you've absorbed a skill from someone without realizing it. I repaired the door hinge. I replaced a section of the roof flashing. I installed a small solar panel on the south-facing wall and ran wiring to 2 LED lights and a charging station. The workshop began to feel less like a shelter we'd stumbled into and more like a home that had been quietly waiting for us. My sister planted a garden in the spring. Tomatoes, mostly, in raised beds she built herself from scrap lumber. They came up slower than she wanted, but they came up. In the second autumn, Joanna called on a Thursday morning while I was on my break at the supply yard. "There's going to be an announcement," she said. "I wanted you to hear it from me first." My father had been charged under Section 380 of the Criminal Code, fraud over $5,000, and under the Ontario Securities Act for unauthorized trading and misrepresentation. 3 of his associated numbered corporations had been dissolved. The RCMP had executed a search warrant on the Calloway Logistics head office in Haliburton 4 months earlier, which my father had managed to keep quiet. I still don't know how, but the results of that search had apparently been the deciding factor in laying charges. The Haliburton Gazette, which had spent 40 years running flattering profiles of my father at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, ran the story on its front page. So did the Peterborough Examiner. The CBC picked it up a day later. My sister texted me a screenshot of the CBC headline with no caption. I understood what she meant. The criminal process took another year. My father hired an expensive defense team out of Toronto. They tried, methodically, to challenge the admissibility of the audio recordings. Canadian law on consent recording is complex, and they had a reasonable argument. But the documentary evidence alone was substantial enough that it didn't matter. He pleaded guilty, eventually, to 2 of the 5 charges, in exchange for a sentencing recommendation. The judge accepted the plea but departed upward from the recommendation. My father was sentenced to 4 years in a federal institution. We were not in the courtroom for the sentencing. Joanna had offered to be there and report back, and we'd said yes. I got her text at 2:47 in the afternoon while I was in the middle of installing a new subfloor in the workshop. I read it standing on my knees with a pry bar in my hand. 4 years, guilty on 2 counts, restitution order for 21M. Call me when you can. I set the pry bar down. I sat there for a while, on the unfinished subfloor, in the workshop my grandfather had built and stocked and left for us like a message in a bottle. Then I called my sister. She answered after 1 ring. I could tell from the quality of the silence that she was in a supply closet at the hospital, the way she always went when she needed privacy. "I heard," she said. "Joanna called me too. Are you okay?" She thought about it for a moment. "I think so. Yeah, I think I actually am." The whistleblower provision came through 6 months later. Because the complaint had originated in part from the OSC filing, and because the enforcement action had resulted in penalties exceeding a threshold set under the Act, my sister and I were eligible for a financial award. The amount was not the kind of number that makes the news, but it was enough, more than enough, to mean something. My sister paid off her student loans in one payment. She called me from her car in the hospital parking lot, laughing, and I could hear her actually laughing, the way she used to laugh before things got hard. I used my share to do something my grandfather would have appreciated. I registered the workshop property officially under a new name. Not Calloway, not anything that had come before, and I filed the paperwork to establish it as a small-scale residential property. I've been expanding it slowly, one room at a time, building the way he taught me without ever sitting down to teach me. Carefully, with good materials, and for keeps. My sister moved up here last spring. She transferred to a hospital in Haliburton and found a place in town, 10 minutes down the road. She comes for dinner on Sundays, sometimes Saturdays too. She brings wine. I cook. We eat at the table I built from a single piece of white ash that fell in a windstorm in the clearing 2 winters ago. The name we go by now isn't the one we were born with. We didn't make a dramatic announcement about it. We just filed the paperwork, paid the provincial fee, and became who we'd always actually been without the weight of a name that never fit. Our grandfather's surname was Merritt, from his mother's side, a name he'd set aside when he married into the Calloway family and quietly regretted losing. We took it. It felt right. It felt like something he'd have wanted. I still think about the night we drove up that gravel road in November, with no money and nowhere to go, and nothing except each other and a key on a plain steel ring. I think about how close we came to just turning around. The road was dark and I was scared, and the rational part of my brain was telling me that a dead man's note and a hand-drawn map were not a plan. But sometimes the people who loved you most do their best work quietly, before you even know you need it. They don't make speeches. They don't make promises. They just make sure that when the worst thing happens, there's a light on somewhere in the dark, and a door that opens for you, and enough inside to get you through to the other side. My grandfather couldn't say most of what he wanted to say while he was alive. He said it the only way he could, in a lockbox on a gravel road in the middle of the Canadian Shield, waiting for us to come find it. We found it. The greatest thing he left us wasn't the property, and it wasn't the evidence, and it wasn't even the money. It was the proof that someone had been thinking about us long before we needed saving. And that proof, more than anything else, was what made us brave enough to save ourselves.